All right, so this is my review for The Beast of Trinity, Texas, which was released in 2025. And I was actually contacted by the director himself, the Terry Weaver, a dream weaver, if you want to call him that. But Mr. Terry Weaver asked me if I would check out his film, and I did. And this is my review of it. And this is my honest opinion. These are my actual thoughts. So, just to, I guess, preface very quickly, I want this to be a review and not so much a summary. But of course, to people that have never seen this film before but might be watching this video, this is what the plot is about. So, The Beast of Trinity, Texas is a film that basically the plot of it starts out where a family of like three or four are camping, and the father finishes up telling some sort of creepy ghost story, and basically he mysteriously dies, and the town sheriff, Sheriff Ridge, Titus Ridge, is tasked with trying to figure out how the guy died. And so what ends up happening is that his deputy, Sheriff Devereaux, or Deputy Devereaux, sorry, had was tasked with trying to figure out where some of the samples of fur came from. And of course, after some lab testing, there was no related sample to any animal within like the United States. So some mysterious creature killed this guy, and they don't know if it is an actual animal or maybe it was a murder. They were saying, oh, it's a homicide, but the sheriff can't figure it out. Now, the idea was for the sheriff to try to figure out how the guy died, and then basically two more people end up dying, and they can't figure it out if it's a murderer on the loose or some sort of special cryptid, right? And I don't want to spoil the film, but I know that sometimes you got to talk about it a little bit so that people will potentially want to watch it. They want to know what they're getting into. So the idea, I don't want to spoil it, but I will say that the idea is that a cryptid, some sort of potential zoological creature, is running rampant in Trinity, Texas, and people are mysteriously dying. Now, it turns out to be a creature, I'll say that much, but honestly, the more I watched the film, the more I realized it's not really so much about the cryptid on the loose, as obviously it's about the characters themselves and the people that are portrayed in this movie. It's more like the cryptid is more of a back burner so that we have something to tie in the stories, these various story threads that connect these people together. Because one thing I thought about with this film is how it doesn't talk about, well, I don't want to stray too far from the plot line, but the idea is that this mysterious cryptid, of course, is identified, and they try to take it down, and it turns out to be part of this scheme that's much bigger than the sheriff's office could have ever planned for. It's a very interesting concept, and I think that if you're into movies that are like a slow burner, then you might potentially like this film. So, uh, like I said, I don't want to spoil the plot, but it's a slow burn. It's 2 hours long, and there are some plot points or just points to the film in general that I feel like this would be worth watching if you are into what I'm about to talk about. So, here's my thoughts about it, uh, about the plot, and mostly really about the characters. So, what I really did like about this film is that I found the writing to be subtle, clever, and actually beautiful in some ways. Now, this might seem strange because this is supposed to be about a cryptid, But there are parts of the movie that are almost poetic, though this is more in the presentation and in some of the acting, actually, than more of the dialogue. Now, I'm not saying the dialogue is bad. It's just that there is a lot of silliness in the movie. It could be quite silly, though, of course, this is on purpose for comedic effect, which I actually do appreciate. In fact, actually, with some of the topics that are talked about in this film, as I've said before, just in other videos on my channel, that sometimes we need comedy to even look at hard subjects. Sometimes you have to laugh before you could even cry. Because if you don't laugh, all you would ever do is cry. So I definitely give the writers, the director, props for his writing style and actually for how certain topics in this movie are presented. I really liked how there were various unsaid things that might go over the average person's head, but when you kind of like, if you play this back or rewatch it or just rewatch certain scenes, you'll find, okay, they didn't actually have to say what is being implied in certain scenes here and there. So, one example of this is that there ends up being a fight between the sheriff and the deputy, and he calls the deputy lazy. Now, I don't want to, well, this is YouTube, so I don't want to, get in trouble with YouTube, but the fact that the sheriff called the deputy lazy, and if you watch this scene, you could tell that more is being implied, but obviously they can't say it in the film. And I thought, that's very clever the way they went about it, because at first I was like, did he mean it that way? Is that what it's supposed to be? But they don't go off and start saying the craziest stuff that would get you like demonetized on YouTube, but it brings up clever ways to present what would sometimes be inner animosity. And to me, I took that fight scene between the sheriff and deputy as something, a very subtle way, as I know I keep saying that, that's the key word. I guess that's the key word to this movie in general, which is subtlety. There are just certain things that they're left unsaid. And to me, I thought of that as a way for, that's something for the viewer to figure out for themselves, which I liked. I really actually liked that. The film is, as I've said before, a slow burn. It's quite long. For me, I thought it was quite long, 2 hours. And this is mostly due to the multiple plot threads that are in the movie, which actually end up tying together in the end. I was a little confused at first when I was watching the movie because I was like, man, okay, so there's this plot point and this plot point and this character's got something going on and that character's got something going on. But it all comes together in the end and pretty much makes sense. After I watched the movie, I took some time to think about it, and there wasn't a single thing brought up that wasn't covered as far as I can remember. There are certain parts that I don't really understand the utility for, I'll put it that way, but I think some of it is for the comedic effect. For example, the end of the film and what ends up happening to the sheriff's daughter kind of makes you go like, what? I was just kind of like, what is even happening? But considering the fact that pretty much anything that has to deal with cryptids is usually humorous in general, I guess you can't really take it seriously to begin with. This isn't about El Chupacabra, but let's say, for example, it was, which for a moment I thought it was going to be. I was like, is this, but no, it's not about El Chupacabra. But I had wondered, I mean, just think of it like that. Can you make a serious, scary film about that? No. But I appreciate it, though I know that maybe some people wouldn't be too happy with that. I just like the fact that there are multiple points to the film, and I think the movie is a great example of how well, in my personal opinion, Terry Weaver can actually write. And I seriously mean that. I think he's a very great writer. In fact, actually, as I had watched the movie, the more I thought about it, the way the characters are written and how they interact with each other and their little plot points together, I thought that pretty much I thought that this movie could actually work out, or at least characters like this would be quite beneficial in really a TV show. I thought that it had more of that kind of slow plot moving. I felt like the plot moved kind of closer to what you would see in a show, like a TV show, as opposed to maybe something super fast in a movie. But this is not a negative contention. This was just something I thought about. I was like, this could work as a show. That's my point. There were multiple times I was watching this and I was like, this could be a TV show, really. I'm not sure what inspired the movie, but I'm curious, just thinking of that off the top of my head. In my personal opinion, even though I know this is advertised as a cryptid movie where they're trying to find it, hunt down the creature, and hopefully try to prevent it from killing any more people, but to me, I found that this is more of an appetizer to what the movie really brings. This is the comedic effect that will lessen the blow to what are actually very deep, hard topics in real life that many people don't want to talk about. For example, my biggest example of this is that the main character, Sheriff Titus Ridge, is the epitome, the common example of a veteran who is in desperate need of help. That is actually in the movie, he is drinking himself to death. In fact, I believe, yeah, the actor who was actually Terry Weaver, the director and writer, he played Sheriff Ridge, and I was just thinking, I hope that he wasn't drinking real alcohol, because my God, the character would constantly drink, constantly. I was like, I hope that it was like O'Doul's non-alcoholic or something like that. But it's real. The idea is real, and I've seen it myself. I found that it was very clever to write about the subject juxtaposed to what the film is, supposed to be about. I thought that it was cleverly brought up in a way that's not throwing it in the viewer's face. The movie doesn't take itself super seriously, obviously. I mean, some of the acting, I'll be honest, some of the dialogue could be cheesy, or the way people present it is cheesy. But to me, I found it funny. I found this usage of comedy allows the viewer to become familiar with the actual heavy subjects in the movie. When you think about it, PTSD, depression, and alcoholism are all things that many veterans suffer from. And it's so funny that I, you know, I found this, I came across this film basically because that is a subject that's very, very near to my heart. If anybody knows me, they would know that I grew up with a military background, and I used to work. uh, Sorry, I guess I used to work if on some of the military bases in my early 20s. One of my favorite jobs was working at the commissary. Uh, it, One of my favorite jobs ever was working at the commissary, and I worked at two Air Force bases and one Army post at their commissaries, and that was probably one of my favorite jobs ever, actually. And I met a lot of veterans. I have veterans in my family, and so for me to see that subject just even lightly touched upon was like, I appreciate him doing this. I appreciate him writing about that because, so many people hear about that. And especially if you've never, especially with the people that don't have a military background, they might not understand the severity of mental illness or just the struggle many veterans will go through once they get out or even when they're still in. I will never forget. I mean, I've met many veterans. I've met Korea War, World War II, some that were World War II and Korea War veterans. And of course, I've met my fair share of Vietnam veterans. And I, I have a soft spot for them. I really do. And I'll never forget, man. I'm not, I just did my makeup, so I'm trying not to ruin it with crying. But I'll never forget some of those veterans I met. In fact, I'll never forget this one. I never knew his name, but when I was working at the commissary, he would come through at least once a week. And he was recently, I'll put it this way, he was medically retired because he had been deployed, and obviously he got into some sort of accident. And I'll never forget him because this man didn't want anybody to help him ever, and he wow. This man struggled to prove his independence because he couldn't walk anymore. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that man. Where his legs were blown off and he didn't have anything past his knees. And you could tell that it really screwed him up mentally. And anytime he would come through, and even if like a vegetable didn't scan correctly, he wouldn't want us to help him. I still think about that man sometimes. Shit. I still hope that man is still alive today. So I know it seems really silly to get all emotional in this movie review. My God. But what I liked about this was that it was real. I mean, it's a silly topic, a cryptid, but just the other things talked about, were actual, I think, good examples. It's very real what our veterans go through. And I'll never forget, there's this other guy. He was one of my coworkers. I'll never forget, his name was Tom. We were cashiers at the commissary, and I don't know why. I don't know what it is with the veterans. You get a veteran, especially the retirees. The retired veterans will always start. They'll just find somebody. They just want somebody to talk to. So fortunately, when you work with the retirees, they're just going to talk your ear off. Tom was another one who was medically retired, but we actually worked together. And he was, he had his quirks. I'll put it nicely. He was kind of a dork. He could be kind of, sometimes, I'll put it this way. Sometimes when we would talk, I'd be like, okay, I know why he was medically retired. But, we had great conversations. And one thing I'll never, ever forget was how Tom had told me, I don't know why. Veterans are so funny. Veterans are so funny. They really are. Where they will talk about the realest shit with you. They really will. And I'll never forget, one time Tom and I were talking about like destiny and fate and soulmates. And I know it's like, oh my God, this guy thought, no. He was just talking about, I guess what you would call esoteric topics right there at the fucking commissary. Here we are talking about destiny and soulmates and fate at Fort Sam, Houston. Think about finding soulmates in Fort Sam. And I'll never forget how Tom had told me that, sometimes, we have multiple soulmates in our lives and they're not always romantic. Many people we meet for a reason. And you know what? I believe it because I still remember him telling me that to this day. You know, I think that there are many people in this life that we meet for a reason. Uh, I'm not going to push my beliefs on people, but, and this is supposed to be a movie review. Here I am getting off on a tangent, reminiscing. But yeah, anyway. So obviously, the veteran kind of portion of this movie was something that I tuned into. It was something I felt a connection to because the way it was presented, I was like, this is real. This is something that veterans actually go through. And so I give points to this movie for that. And I like that at the end of the movie, it shows that the sheriff did end up getting help because that was one of the things like his deputy had asked him to do. Like, you need to get help, and he did, and yes, it was at the end of the film, kind of like the shore at the very end, but at least they actually showed it. And at least, it showed that people can get help for what is haunting them inside, no matter what they go through. So I absolutely loved the nods toward Texas. I laughed at this one line in the movie. There's this scene where Sheriff Titus's secretary, Autumn, she goes to a bar and she's with like her ex because her ex decides that he wants her back or whatever crap. And the ex is actually kind of creepy when you think about it. I don't know if it was supposed to be creepy. As a woman, I've stated before, like in my review of the clown murders, I had said, if my ex ever kidnapped me, I would be fucking scared. Now, Autumn's ex, I believe his name was Jeff, he didn't kidnap her, but he like was really coming on to her really strong. And in fact, the really creepy part was where Autumn decides to go all out for a run at night in the dark. Granted, she had like the special flashlight helmet on, but then her ex, Jeff, tackles her. Well, not tackles her, but he like runs up and catches her, hugs her. And she was kind of scared, like, what are you doing? Oh my God. He's like, I miss you. I want to be back with you again. And she's like, look, basically like telling him, like, let me think about it in a way. And, just trying to be like, let me just go home. And I was like, that's really creepy if you think about it. If your ex was to just wait for you in the forest because they knew that's when you decide to go exercising alone, that could be a really bad situation. But anyway, that's not really touched on. I don't know if that was supposed to be taken that way. That's just a thought I had. But anyway, so in this scene though, she's with him at the bar and he says, every time I see a blue bonnet, I think of you. And I just laughed because if you don't know, Texas, the state flower is the bluebonnet. And especially right now as I record, it's March. And so this is the time of year in Texas where you start driving on the highways and our wildflowers are everywhere because that's something our what is it? Our road department, DPS, I think, does somebody. But the state of Texas actually will drive on the highways and spray wildflower seeds. And so you drive around between March through about late May and you'll just see bunches of flowers, blue bonnets, black-eyed Susans. I think I can't remember what the pink ones are called, but there's pink flowers. There's the Indian paintbrushes. And so anyway, I just really loved that line because I was like, you know what? I mean, you see them all the time on the highways. So it's just funny to me, like, oh yeah, I bet this guy's driving down the highway. Oh my God, I think of her. Please. Like, that is so cheesy. So cheesy. But, kudos to the writers for putting that in there. It's so silly. If you live in Texas, if you're familiar with Texas culture, there's nods towards it that's like, okay, I like this. All right, this is a pretty good movie. What I also really loved is where this film is filmed. I don't know exactly what every spot is, and it's probably better we don't know. You don't want to ruin the place in real life. But it was very clear that the movie was filmed in real Texas towns in actual Texas settings. It was so nice to see what were they're stereotypical in a way. You see them in every town, but it had the beautiful old downtown buildings with the facades, which is a common sight in literally big or small, just about every single Texas downtown area. And I smiled when I saw this because I also smiled when they filmed in the little towns, and there's actually a scene where it's distinct that they are actually in Houston. And I was like, "Oh my God, I've seen that graffiti so many times on the highway in Houston." So I just really loved those nods. There was also some of course there were the cowboy hats, and of course there were some bull horns, animal horns, and stuff like that. In fact, I should be wearing my cowboy hat right now. Can you see that? Anyway, so, but yes, there were, of course, cowboy hats. The sheriff had a cowboy hat. The one company that's mentioned in the film would have cowboy hats. The Texas Rangers, they have cowboy hats. So anyway, it's kind of stereotypical, but it's also quite funny. It's silly because it has those nods. They talk about blue bonnets a little bit. You have, some country people. Though, of course, it's not every single bit of Texas. It's still just a little bit, but it's nice to those of us who are from the area. And you're like, hey, thanks for including us in here. In some ways, it was kind of a little bit like the not like the movie Mardi Gras Massacre, but it was in that same note as that movie where Mardi Gras Massacre very obviously had actual locals from Louisiana, from very likely New Orleans, acting in that movie. So I like that. I like it when movies are homebrew like this and they talk about, or basically they use what they have. They don't ship out people from all across the world just for one scene. I did find it kind of peculiar where the sheriff's daughter in one scene made a comment about, oh, you trigger happy Texans. I guess she moved out of the state when she left her dad's house at some point. But it's kind of strange. Like, why would you say it like that? Like as if you weren't a Texan yourself? I mean, in my opinion, once a Texan, always a Texan. But some people leave and they act like they're too good for it here, right? But that's a joke, by the way. Anyway. Also, I had to give props in this movie because there was a colonel, because they also had this plot point about a bridge. Actually, this is kind of ended up being a major plot point, but some veterans are trying to protect a bridge from being like torn down. And the main the leader of the veterans from the VSW is a retired colonel. And I actually give props to this movie for when they show this one scene where the colonel has like an old jacket, I believe it was on, and he actually had the colonel, insignia or the colonel pins on his collar. I was like, oh, they did what is that movie? The Amazing Bulk couldn't. I was like, in The Amazing Bulk, they were like, oh, here's the colonel. And the colonel had like enlisted chevrons on. And I was like, that's not a colonel. Those are, anyway, I give this movie props for doing it right. So overall, the movie I found to be actually very beautiful. Without a doubt, seriously. The filmography, cinematography is very amazing. I really admired the contrasting art. Well, it's artistic, actually. It's very artsy in many ways. And the contrasting colors, where at the end of the film, they use a lot of orange and blue lights to convey this dramatic effect. I thought that was clever because just with color theory, orange and blue are opposite colors. And so, it's like red and green, orange and blue, and I believe yellow and purple. You juxtapose them, against each other, beside each other, and they just stand out more. It's like I'm wearing red right now, but you can see that green yarn behind me really well, can't you? Those are opposite colors. Opposites attract, right? Yin and yang, opposites attract. But anyway, so I really liked the cinematography. The camera work is very beautiful. In fact, to me, that is one of the reasons why the movie can almost seem poetic in a way. It's quite artistically done. I mean, really huge props to the cameraman, camera crew, because obviously whoever was filming that themselves did a really great job. Because most people, I think, just think of maybe the writers, the director, and of course the actors to a movie. Like, oh, thank God for the actors, oh, this actor, that actress. But you know what? The camera crew to most movies is forgotten about. Yeah, obviously they're the most important because they're the ones recording it. So whoever recorded this movie, I mean, they did a really good job, and I seriously mean that. So there was some other things, in the film that I found quite interesting. For example, there was one part where Sheriff Ridge, first of all, Sheriff Ridge was the type of person, well, in the movie, he is a combat veteran. He obviously had PTSD from being deployed. They don't, I believe, say where, but I'm assuming, supposed to assume he was deployed to the Middle East, which would be, I believe, current to like the times, so to speak. Like, I think it was implied that Sheriff Ridge was probably about deployed in the early 2000s, give or take. And his PTSD memory seems to reflect that. So he would wake up in the middle of the night at times, freaking out, and he would look at himself in the mirror and like yell at himself, or at least imagine yelling at himself, where he would say, "Who are you?" But it was very interesting where he would wake up in the middle of the night, and at one time he woke up at 3:33 a.m. and I was like, I wonder what that's supposed to mean. I think that it was a subtle foreshadowing for what ends up happening at the end of the film. For those who know what 333 is supposed to mean to people that believe in that kind of stuff. And for that, I actually really appreciate that in the film. Overall, I think that this was actually a pretty good film. Of course, it's not like some mind blowing, gonna take your breath away type of film. But as I've said before, that's not the kind of thing I want to watch. Personally, if it makes me laugh and it makes me think, I think that it wasn't a waste of time. In fact, to put it this way, if I finished the film, it was either good enough for me to finish or bad enough to make me finish. Sometimes I think the worst thing a film could be is boring. And actually, I didn't find this one boring. It takes its time, I think, is the biggest contention I will put for it. I think that maybe some people wouldn't be into a film like this, but if you are familiar with the film, I believe it's called 1922. If you ever seen the movie 1922, which is based off of a Stephen King story, that is also a slow burn. And I actually liked that one too. The writing is quite similar, though, of course, 1922 is like a horror film. But I found the style itself and how it takes its time in presenting the plot points to be similar in that way. So honestly, I give this film 3 stars. And I know it's like, well, why isn't it this or that? Da, 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 da. Just hear me out. I think it should be 3 stars and probably one big foot. All right.